Assalamu alaikum. This podcast has been brought to you by Seeker's Guidance, the Global Islamic Seminary. Help us spread the light of prophetic guidance to millions around the world by becoming a monthly supporter. Make a small donation at seekersguidance.org/donate. As little as $10 a month can help people find life-changing guidance.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Today the question from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, why don't you give me a loan? This question comes from a verse of the Quran that we've seen and heard, I'm sure, many times, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, من ذا الذي يقرض الله قرضا حسنا فيضاعفه له أضعافا كثيرة. Who is it that will give Allah a goodly loan so that he may give increase to it manifold? والله يقبض ويبسط وإليه ترجعون. Allah is the one who straightens and Allah is the one who enlarges, and to him alone will you all return. So if you look at the question carefully, why don't you give me a loan? There's something strange that should come to your mind. There's something wrong, something that doesn't make sense. What would it mean to give a loan to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Before I go on to explain what exactly is strange and what the answer to that strangeness is, I just want to put in a disclaimer. So I'm not asking you for money. So in Ramadan, I remember Laylatul Qadr, and we go to the masajid to worship, and the mosques, they take advantage of the large number of congregants in order to do some fundraising. Now, I don't, I'm not criticizing them, because the masajid, they do need to run, and they are only run by the support of the Muslim community. However, whenever this verse is when somebody hears this verse, especially in a religious time, from a religious person, from somebody who, not that I'm religious, but in this context, it sends off alarm bells. So I want to put you at rest. This is not a fundraiser. I'm not asking you for any money. But what I want to do is, I want to help you understand this verse of the Quran, and I want to help you understand this question that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks in the Quran, and it's asked more than once. And in this question, he asks, who is it that will give me a loan? And this question is a strange question, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't need anything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is, in this question, he is coming down to our level out of his mercy for us. What does that mean? It means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he doesn't need for us. We'll see that this verse is more general than actually giving charity. But let's assume that it's talking about giving charity or giving money. So when somebody asks you for a loan, why do they ask you for a loan? They ask you for a loan because they are in need of you. They need the money that you have. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't need anything. In fact, the money that he seems to be asking us for is given to us by him. It's a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the verse at the end of this verse, it says that Allah is the one who straightens, meaning who one of the meanings of straightening is that that reduces the provision that somebody has, and He is the one who enlarges and makes expansive the provision that people have. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who gave us our wealth in the first place, and He doesn't need our money. And we're not really giving Him anything because He doesn't need it. He created it, and the reward that He gives us for doing an act of charity is it's His sheer generosity. We'll see, it's His sheer generosity. So here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Mufassirun, they say that this is from the tanazzulat, that the tanazzulat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to His servants. What does tanazzul mean? Tanazzul means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is great and tremendous beyond our imagination. And we cannot understand who He is. We cannot understand how perfect He is. We cannot understand how tremendous He is. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He speaks to us in a language that we can understand. And He comes down to our level so that we can understand something. And so when He comes down to our level so that we can understand something, we need to keep in mind that this is the creator of every atom in the universe who is speaking, and we need to understand what it is that He is saying to us. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in this verse, He addresses us in the language of someone who is in need. Someone comes to you and asks you and says, please give me some money. He addresses us in the language of someone who is in dire need, because the person who is in dire need says, give me some money, I need it so much, I'll pay you back that and many times more. I don't care. Right now I'm in need of the money. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He addresses us in the language of someone who is in need, someone who is in dire need, but we remember that the one who is speaking doesn't need us. He doesn't need us at all. And He is addressing us in this way out of His mercy for us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is coming down to our level out of His mercy for us. So what does this mean? Well, in order to understand what exactly is being said here, let's take this statement. The lion returned to his den. So let's imagine that there is a brave soldier who fought courageously in a battle, and he returned home from the battlefield, and he's playing with his children, and he is having dinner with his wife, and someone looks at this and you might not realize how courageous and brave this soldier is on the battlefield, and so you make the remark that the lion has returned to his den. Now, when you say the lion has returned to his den, when you're in this context, there is in fact no lion. There's no lion to be spoken of. And there's also no den to be spoken of. But what you're saying is that the situation of a courageous soldier fighting bravely in the battlefield and returning home and playing with his children and having dinner with his wife, this situation has a resemblance to the situation of a lion who goes out to hunt his prey and then comes home to his den, and then he sleeps and he has his cubs and his mate with him, and he seems non-threatening, and it seems like there's nothing dangerous about him. So there's a similarity between this situation and this situation, and we are speaking in the language of another situation in order to bring out a similarity, in order to drive home a point. And in this case, one of the similarities is that someone who is very dangerous has come home and is behaving in a way that is very normal and non-threatening, and but don't and it has carries a meaning that don't think that just because he's behaving in this non-threatening way that he is someone who isn't brave, who isn't this courageous soldier. So this is a rhetorical device. The scholars of Arabic eloquence, they call this a complex metaphor, an isti'ara tamthiliya. And that is what is happening in this verse. So in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He asks the question, He says, who is it? Who is it that will lend unto Allah a goodly loan, so that He may give it increase manifold? So there's a loan that's given, and there is a repayment with increase, with interest, many times over, compounded many times over. So the when you look at this, so actually, if we do the same analysis as the lion returns to his den, you will see that in fact there is no loan that is given. There's actually no loan that is being given, and there's actually also no interest that is being given in return. What's happening? What's happening is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using the language of this situation where there is someone giving someone else a loan and being paid back many times over. He is using this language to speak about another situation, which is the situation of doing something now, doing a good deed now, in order to seek reward later on. So this verse is actually, the scholars of tafsir, they explain that it's not just talking about giving money. It's talking more generally about the idea of sacrifice. So and it applies strongly to the giving of charity, because the idea of sacrifice is strongly related to the giving of money in a good cause. Why? Because we love our money, and when we have money, and we can do all of these things with our money, um, the money is a source for us to attain seemingly everything that we want. So when we take this thing which represents everything that I want, I can attain through this money, and give it I give it to someone, I spend it for a good cause, um, in order to seek the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the next life. And I know that this reward that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give me in the next life will be many times greater than the money that I spend. Then there is a similarity between this situation and between the situation of someone lending someone money and getting it back, but many times over. Now, this is related to the idea of sacrifice, and some of the mufassirun, they say, so the verses before and after, they're talking, the context is the battles that the Prophet and his companions, they fought from Medina against the Meccans, and in fighting those battles, there was sacrifice that was involved. But sacrifice involved the sacrifice of injury and possibly one's own life, and it also involved the sacrifice of money. And so, but the idea is this general sacrificing in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And other mufassirun, they say that this verse, it applies to every kind of good deed that you could do, and the charity and sacrificing one's own self for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are both included in those good deeds. But in every kind of good deed, there is some kind of a sacrifice that someone makes, because one does something for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instead of doing it for oneself. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us in this verse that if we do that, if we forego something in this life for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we do something now to seek reward later, then it's like someone who lends Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who lends someone money and will get it back many times over. But in reality, we have to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is coming down to our level when He is speaking in this way, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the money in the first place. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He doesn't need our money. When we spend our money, when we do something for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the benefit of that returns to us. And it doesn't return to us because of what we do, but it returns to us through the direct generosity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because when we do something for Allah, it doesn't benefit Him. And when He gives us a reward, that reward is not dependent, is not strictly dependent on our having done the first good deed in the first place. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His mercy, out of His gentleness, He speaks to us in this way, to encourage us, and that's what's intended by this verse. This verse is an encouragement, and that's why at the end of this verse, after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, who is it that will lend unto Allah a goodly loan so that He may give it increase manifold? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Wallahu yaqbidu wa yabsut. What does this mean? This means that the straightening, the qabd, is the difficulties that arise in our lives. These difficulties might be financial difficulties, or they might be some other kind of difficulty. But whenever there's a situation where doing something for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will possibly put us into a difficult situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding us. First, He encourages us to do what what is truly beneficial for us, and then He reminds us that the difficulties that come, they are technically not related to the actions that we take. We imagine that by giving charity, or by sacrificing our time, or by foregoing something else, that we will be put as a result of that into a difficult situation. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that He is the one who puts us into difficult situations, and He is the one who enlarges. He is the one who puts us into situations of ease. And we need to, this goes back to the first question that we asked from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why do you take gods apart from me? Where we reminded ourselves that the one who is running everything directly in the universe is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So since that's the case, since it's the case that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who straightens and enlarges, since that's the case, we should keep in mind the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and make the sacrifice that He is encouraging us to make. Because at the end of the verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that at the end of the day, it is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone that all of us will return, and the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will definitely come. There's no doubt about it. So this verse, one more point, they mentioned that the Mufassirun, they mentioned that goodly loan, what does it mean, a qard hasan? It means something that is done sincerely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A good deed that is done not seeking anything except the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is the goodly loan. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala multiplies it many times over with the reward that He gives us in the next life. And now we come to our question. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, who is it that will lend unto Allah a goodly loan so that He may give it increase manifold? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who constrains and straightens, and He is the one who gives expansiveness and enlarges, and unto Him you will return. Who is it? What's the purpose of this question? This is not a real question, because we saw that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He knows everything. So for Him to ask a real question is impossible. So the purpose of this question is encouragement. It's like you're saying to somebody, who is it that will get this great thing? And the response that is being evoked is, I'll do it. It'll be me. I'll do it. I'll get that great thing. And that's the response that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is eliciting from us when He in this verse. So who is it that will lend unto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a goodly loan so that He may give it increase manifold? And Allah is the one who straightens and enlarges, and unto Him alone you will all return. So that's the meaning of the question of this episode. Why don't you give me a loan? So I'll conclude with a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to illustrate the increase, the manifold increase in the afterlife. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that verily in paradise there is a tree, and under the shade of this tree someone who's riding a horse can travel for 100 years and he'll still be under the shade of that tree. Now again, the delights of paradise are unexpressible. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet told us that in paradise there is that which no eye has ever seen, nor any ear has ever heard, nor has occurred to the heart of any human being. And yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He speaks about the delights of paradise. But again, He speaks to us in ways that we can understand. So what exactly is this tree? We don't understand it. What exactly is the shade? We don't understand it. However, we do understand. However, it is a tree and there is a shade. We're not denying that. But its reality is far greater than the trees and the shade that we experience in this life. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is, the commentators, they say that what's meant by shade here is comfort. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking to the primary audience of the Quran and Sunnah, is the ancient Arabs. And the ancient Arabs, they were people who lived in the desert where it was very hot, and where shade was, if you travel in the hot desert, if you walk in the hot sun, and just sitting underneath a tree and the coolness that you feel in shade is a tremendous delight. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He speaks to these people, and through them He speaks to us, and He says, verily in paradise there is a tree under whose shade a rider can travel for 100 years and the shade doesn't get used up. And so and this is just talking about a single tree. What about the delights of paradise? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, لَهُمْ مَا يَشَاءُونَ فِيهَا, they shall have whatever they want in it, وَلَدَيْنَا مَزِيدٌ, and with us there is even more. So this is to help us understand what the verse means when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, who is it that will give me a goodly loan that I can increase it many times over? What does the increase many times over mean? We can get some inkling of what that means from this hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that was the question for today. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you for listening. This podcast was brought to you by Seekers Guidance, the Global Islamic Seminary. Visit seekersguidance.org to access reliable Islamic knowledge taught by qualified teachers. We offer a wide range of courses, podcasts, articles, and a world-class answer service. Support us in spreading free, reliable Islamic knowledge to millions around the world by becoming a monthly supporter. Visit seekersguidance.org/donate and make a small monthly commitment today. Our beloved Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, "Whoever guides someone to goodness will have a similar reward." So don't forget to share this podcast and spread prophetic guidance.